Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is our last, I'm Charlie Junkerman, I'm the Dean of Continuing Studies, and it's nice to see all of you for this, which will be the last event in our quarterly series, Earth Matters, a series that Continuing Studies designed and implements in collaboration with the School of what we used to call Earth Sciences, and now we call the School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. This is, for some of us, an almost bittersweet moment, because those of you who know about such things may know that Cummings Art Building and Annenberg Auditorium are coming down this summer. This is not our very last event in this auditorium, but our penultimate event. And I feel nostalgic. It's a great room, and we'll have a good time tonight. It's very conversational, as you'll see, and so we'll make the best of our second to last presence in this auditorium. As I said, the quarterly series, is a collaboration between us and the school. The programs in Earth Matters are designed to address timely topics that are being studied by faculty and students in the school and more broadly across Stanford. These range from such consequential questions as how our planet works to the enormous resource and environmental challenges that we face now and that we will continue to face in the coming decades. I have just a few words of introduction to offer you, but before I do that, I want to say a special thanks to Nancy Peterson, who's standing back there in the orange sweater, waving her hand. Nancy has had a number of leadership roles at the university over the years and in the private sector. And most recently, she's been serving as the Director of Communication for the School of Earth Sciences. All of us who are her colleagues value her intelligence, her knowledge, her geniality, and we'll miss her tremendously. So please give Nancy a big round of applause. So let's get underway tonight. Leading tonight's program is the Dean of the School, Pam Matson, the Chester Narramore Dean of the School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. She's a global leader in sustainability science and has particular expertise in understanding the interactions between humans and the environment. She's been the author of a number of important documents. Too many wires up here for me right now. Significant in the field and important to all of us who depend on scientists to think about and figure out how to deal with issues of sustainability. The first one that I'll mention is a document that came out in 2000, the year 2000, Our Common Journey, A Transition Towards Sustainability. That was paired with a document in 2010, also issued by the Academy, National Academy, America's Climate Choices, 2010. She's also the author of a book called Seeds of Sustainability, Lessons from the Birthplace of the Green Revolution, which synthesizes the work of 15 years of research in agricultural sustainability that's been done by her colleagues here at Stanford and in Sonora, Mexico. And the book she's working on now is entitled Pursuing Sustainability, which will be released later 2015 by Princeton University Press, so stand by for that. Because of her accomplishments, her leadership, her vision, Pam was the recipient of this very distinguished fellowship called the MacArthur Fellowship early in her career, and she was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. She's also a wonderful person and a colleague and very generous to be here tonight and to have invited 3 distinguished colleagues to join her in a panel discussion, 2 of whom are here, and the third said that he was giving his kids some dinner and then he'd be right over. So we have our fingers crossed for Adam Brandt, Professor of Energy Resources Engineering who we hope will be with us shortly. But the two who are here in body are Ruth DeFries, the Denning Family Professor of Sustainable Development at Columbia University, and Jim Leape, the former Director General of the World Wildlife Fund, and the Cox Visiting Professor here at Stanford. So we couldn't be happier to have three and potentially four fabulously informed, knowledgeable colleagues to help us think about this question. And I'm sure we all feel that this question, the subtitle of our talk tonight, is recurring more and more frequently and ominously, this existential question that we ask ourselves, is it too late? And we'll leave it to you to help us answer that question. So please join me in welcoming our panelists tonight.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for having us here. Thank you to Nancy Peterson. I have to add my great thanks for helping to create this idea and so many others for the School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. Thank all of you for being here tonight. This is the last of our series of Earth Matters this year. We hope for another series next year. But Charlie had suggested, when we talked about the topic for tonight, that we address this question, sustainability, is it too late? And I have to say, when he asked that, I thought, oh my gosh, I hope it's not too late. Because for me, sustainability means well-being. The well-being of all of us here, the well-being of people around the world, the well-being of my children, and if I'm lucky enough, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and all of yours too. So I hope it's not too late for them. So tonight, we're going to explore the prospects for long-term well-being, for long-term sustainability. And to help me do that, we have a great panel. We have two of them here. And you know, I just happen to know that this audience is filled with other experts. So if Adam isn't able to show up, I'm going to call on somebody else in this room. And we'll have a full panel discussion no matter what. So, but it's going to be very fun to get different perspectives. And as Charlie said, we're really lucky to have Ruth DeFries, a professor from Columbia University, and Jim Leape, the Cox Visiting Professor in the School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences and the Woods Institute here, and a Director General of the World Wildlife Fund International. And we have different perspectives on this. There's probably quite a bit of overlap, but maybe some divergent perspectives as well on this question. So we'll see how those perspectives come out in our panel discussion. But first of all, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them in a minute, but before I do that, let me introduce the term sustainability. What do we mean when we say sustainability? And it's kind of an interesting question because I'm sure you know that it's everywhere. You know, it's sort of in the air. You pick up a magazine and there's a sustainability this or that. There's a sustainability effort. There's a sustainability coordinator or program or whatever. And there are a couple of different uses of this term and a couple of different communities who use the term sustainability. One that is, I think, very important in terms of sort of international leadership is the corporate community that talks about sustainability. They invest in sustainability. And when they talk about sustainability, corporations often talk about the triple bottom line. And what that means is decision-making that makes sense economically, environmentally, and socially. But there are other terms, you know, the three-legged stool, the 3 E's, different ways of showing, you know, this idea of these 3 important components. I don't like the Mickey Mouse model myself, but you know, there's different ways but you get the point. And a lot of corporations are engaged in this. They have been leaders in this. And one of the reasons they have is that they've saved a lot of money because of this. It's driven them to use resources more efficiently and so forth. So that's one community, and that's a sustainability that organizations like Stanford University have really engaged in our operations. We think about those things when we decide how to build a building or how to build a transportation system or our new energy plant that just opened up. So, you know, that harkens to us. But there's another community that thinks about sustainability and has for decades, and that's the community that focuses on sustainable development. Development meaning efforts to improve the well-being and the livelihoods of people in some of the poorest parts of the world. Back in the 1980s, there was a World Commission on Environment and Development. Many people call it the Brundtland Report because it was led by Gro Brundtland, who's been a prime minister of Norway and an ambassador and a number of other things. But she led this commission. And their perspective, and the perspective that's held in the decades since, is that the challenge here is to meet people's needs, that is, to help countries develop, but to do it in a way that doesn't compromise the future, so that future generations can also have their needs met. Now, so those are two of the ways we think about sustainability. There are other definitions, but I would argue that there's a lot in common among those different uses and definitions. One is a focus on human well-being, intergenerational well-being. This is a very anthropocentric perspective. It's not an environmentalist one. It's worrying about people today and in the future, here and around the world. But that requires attention to not only meeting the needs of people, but doing it in a way that protects the environment for the long term, so that our children and great-grandchildren can have their needs met. So in a way, what we're doing is balancing here between efforts to meet the needs of people and for food and energy and water and shelter and education and healthcare, and at the same time sustain the life support systems of the planet, our environment, our atmosphere and water systems, our climate system, our species and ecosystems on land and in the oceans that we get so much from, that we need in order to survive, and that future generations will also need. So it's a pretty simple statement. So then we can ask, so how well are we doing in that dual goal of meeting needs and protecting the life support systems? And we can start here today with, how are our social needs being met? There's some really good news in this one. It is true right now that infant mortality rates are in decline around the world. Lifespans have increased just about everywhere. More people have access to health care and to education and to employment today than ever before. So there's been some real successes. And yet, 1 billion people still don't have access to modern forms of energy or to sanitation or clean water, and 1 billion people, almost 1 billion people, go to bed hungry a lot of the time. There's a widening disparity between the world's richest and the world's poorest. And that's today. And we have to remind ourselves that the global population is still increasing. We will add another few billion people before we finally level off, hopefully sometime in the end of this century. So we've got still some very significant challenges in terms of meeting the needs of people today and as we continue to grow and consume. How are we doing on the life support system side, on that protecting our environment and resource side? Well, here, yes, there are certainly some success stories. You talk about the fact that we've learned how to clean up air pollution and water pollution at local scales, and yet there are region-wide tides of air pollution around the planet today. Climate is changing. It is caused largely by our own activities, and it is having impacts on things we care about and will in the future, depending on how we act now. Oceans are acidifying thanks to this rapid increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. More than half of the ice-free land surface of the planet has been changed by human activities. The geographers of the last several decades have helped us understand just how great our footprint on the planet has been. We're losing biological diversity at rates that are 10 to 100 or more thousand times faster than background rates. And this is one of those changes that maybe it's too late for some of those species that we've lost. They're not coming back. A few years ago, there was about 10 years ago actually, a Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was done globally. Hal Mooney, I saw him in here, was one of the great leaders of that. And that assessment basically said, there's maybe 60% of the the services that we get from ecosystems on land and in the oceans are in decline. You know, they're on their way down, and we need those resources. And then on and on. Water limitations, overdrawing of groundwater systems. This is, you know, everyday conversation in California today. So lots to worry about on the life support system side. What I think the main problem has been for us is that as we have tried very hard to meet the needs of people over the, you know, millennia that humanity has been on the planet, we've inadvertently had really negative consequences for a lot of our life support systems. And the challenge of sustainability and looking forward, the real opportunities for sustainability are, in a sense, changing that relationship, figuring out how to meet the needs of people, but at the same time, finding ways to do it as we sustain the life support systems of the planet. So the fact is we don't really know how to do that. We have some great experiments going on. We've got some really great examples of how we can move in that direction. I personally, I'm an optimist, and I feel like we're moving in that direction. But we've got a lot to learn, and we're learning from lessons of things that don't work as well as things that do work. And our topic tonight, really, and our engagement of these two panelists, and probably another one of you in the room, will be to think about how we're moving this transition to sustainability forward. We're not going to get there overnight. We're going to learn as we go. What are we doing? How are we learning from the process? And what does that mean for our future? So with that, I'm going to join the panelists. I would love to invite Roz Naylor to come up. You may. Okay. You may remember Roz gave the first of our Earth Matters discussions this year on food security. And fascinating discussion. We'll get her to reflect a little bit on some of those things and other areas in which she's working in this conversation. And then anyone else who wants to join in can as well. But okay, so let me start and just ask a few questions of our panelists, give them a little bit of a chance to tell you about where they're coming from around these sustainability challenges. We'll have a little bit of dialogue back and forth, and then we're going to open it to all of us to talk together. But I want to start with Ruth DeFries. So as Charlie said, Ruth is the Denning Professor of Sustainable Development at Columbia University. She is a geographer who focuses on how human activities affect land and ecosystems and the well-being of people. And she is a much awarded and highly recognized scientist. She is the winner of a MacArthur Fellowship, elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a number of other professional organizations, and truly a leader in these issues. She just published a book called The Big Ratchet that traces the story over millennia of how our efforts, humans' efforts to meet our own needs play out, and how we accomplish them and what the implications are. And we'll ask Ruth to talk a little bit about that, but I'll mention right now that she's giving a talk tomorrow afternoon in our environmental forum in the Yang and Yamazaki Environment and Energy Building at 3:30 if anybody really wants to come and hear the whole story of the Big Ratchet. But Ruth, tell us a little bit about that story. Why did you write that? What were you thinking about? What led to your perspectives on this interaction between people and their resources and environment? And what does it mean for this question and for the future?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's really always a pleasure to come to Stanford. I think I'll turn that question around a little bit and talk about my recent experience since the book came out. I've just come back from a couple of months in rural India, very much immersed in rural India with farmers and talking to a lot of farmers. And India is a country which is still very agricultural based, although on a quick economic trajectory, probably similar to what this country was at the beginning of the last century. You'd think that the topic of conversation among the farmers would be about climate, and indeed climate is very important for agriculture in India, but it really wasn't so much. The big topic of conversation was the dynamics that are changing so rapidly in urbanization, in people going to the small towns, the medium-sized towns, the big cities for labor and to be part of this economic growth of the country, which is really very much changing the whole dynamic of the countryside. It's really changing how people get their resources. So this is not just in India, this is everywhere where urbanization is so rapidly increasing. By the middle of this century, the world population will be about 70% urban. We're a little over half right now. So this is a big dynamic. I know we're very used to living urban lifestyles here in this country, but where the bulk of the world's population is, which is Asia, urbanization is extremely rapid. And why does that really matter, and how does it relate back to the story of the big ratchet? It matters because, one of the reasons it matters is because everyone in cities needs to eat. They need food. And that food then, they're going to grocery stores, they're going to restaurants, they're going to food stalls or wherever people grow their food, but they're not growing food themselves. They're relying on the commercial production of food. So here we are on the brink of having a very big change in the way that we humans relates to the planet in terms of the way food is produced. So in not too long, most people on the planet will be getting food the way that we do. We go to the grocery store instead of growing it ourselves. So we're seeing a sort of a commodification of food production, and I want to talk about the opportunity that that affords us in answering this question. We often hear about impending shortages of food production and the specter of climate change, and indeed it is quite daunting to think about feeding the billions that are already here and the few billion more people who will be added to the planet. But I don't think producing enough, just producing enough, is really the issue. We are very, very good, and this is what the story of the big ratchet shows. We are very good at ingeniously manipulating the Earth system that we have to produce more. And every time that we've been at where it seems to be a shortage on the horizon, we've figured out how to produce more. So we're good at producing more. It will be quite a challenge to produce enough that we need in the future, but I don't worry about that so much because we're very good at that. What I worry more about is how we're producing that food and what are the consequences of that. What are the impacts on biodiversity? What are the impacts on water quality from nitrogen runoff from fertilizer? What's the impact on the atmosphere through greenhouse gases? And how do we produce the nutritious food that people need, not just enough calories, but the nutritious food. So it's more about, at this point, we've been at many points in history where we've just needed to produce more and there's been shortages, which we have met by and large, although there was not equitable distribution, as Pam said. But right now I think we're at a pivot point where the issue is more about quality as much as it is about quantity. So I think we're really at a pivot point where we have devised so many technologies to produce more and more and more. Now we have the sustainability question of how do we use that ingenuity that we have developed to produce better, better for people and better for the planet. So this commodification of food production seems a bit scary. But as I said, I think it's a real opportunity, and Jim will, I think, talk more about that. That it's an opportunity to think about where the supply chain is coming from and where the leverage points are in the supply chain to produce the food that people by. So we've seen a couple of successes with that already. There's a long way to go. We've seen deforestation in Brazil is a fragile success story, I guess you could say, in that deforestation has reduced dramatically over the course of the last 8 or 9 years. And the deforestation was primarily driven by commodity, by producing meat, either the beef directly or the soy to feed the animals which produced meat. So there's been a real success in that, which came from a combination of government policies, pressure from NGOs, advancement in science for monitoring, a whole confluence of factors which has led to that success, which really was only possible because there is this supply chain of the products that were coming out of the deforested land. Now the focus of that attention has moved quite a bit to Southeast Asia, where palm oil is a big concern, and the efforts are underway to, which we'll hear more about from Jim, to try to go for successes in that situation also, where we're not reducing production, rather increasing production, but in a better way, in a way that preserves the life systems of the planet and produces healthy food. So what does it take to be successful? Of course, individual consumer decisions like you and me, that's always important, but really it takes a whole look at the supply chain to figure out where the leverage points are, where the products are coming from that are leading to the deforestation or leading to the overuse of fertilizer, and how to influence that supply chain. So it's a combination of the science, of course, NGOs, governments, the private sector, all of these actors working together to address the issues of sustainability. So I think this urbanization and this different way we are as a species in terms of how we get food affords us to think about the traceability, the accountability of the supply chain for food production. And I'm optimistic, guardedly optimistic, that it's not too late for sustainability. It's rather the beginning, and we will always be changing our thinking about sustainability. So it's not that we can come up with a solution, check that off, and move on to the next issue.
That's right. It's a transition that we're in. It's not an end point that we're going to get to, in a sense. Yeah. But Ruth, there's so many things that you said that I would love to pick up and discuss. I mean, I think your point about needing to get all the pieces together right in order to have the success that you're talking about with supply chains, it's a really scary proposition. And maybe Jim can be talking about that a little bit. How do you do that? But there's also, I want to, we'll come back later if we have time to your point about, sustainability isn't for us around food is both increasing production to meet the needs of people, increasing quality, and doing it all without those negative environmental consequences. And you're feeling pretty optimistic about the increasing production part. And I know lots of people who are really, really worried about that. So we'll come back and see if we can pick up on that in a little while. So great, thank you. So I want to turn to Jim Leape. Jim is the Cox Visiting Professor in the School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences, and also a visiting fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment here at Stanford. So we're very excited to have him part of our community. But he did just step down as Director General of the World Wildlife Fund International. And really that's one of the world's very largest conservation organizations. Prior to his 10 years as Director General, Jim was the Director of the Conservation and Science Program at the Packard Foundation, so back here in California for a while. Before that, he was the Senior Vice President for World Wildlife Fund US in Washington, D.C. So Jim, you've spent, well, he's a lawyer too, I should mention that, Harvard Law School. But you've spent your life with concerns around environment and conservation, and really focusing on that in so many different positions that you've had. So tell us a little bit about how you came from there to to perspectives on sustainability, from a conservation perspective to a sustainability perspective, and what are the paths forward, do you think?
Okay, thanks, Pam. I find actually I have a different starting point and a similar destination to where Ruth has just taken us. I always have to start a session like this by admitting that I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. I haven't practiced it a long time, but that is where I started. And actually that is, in this context, I think, significant. When I was in school, which let's just say was the last century, the environmental movement was just taking shape in this country. The environmental movement was led by lawyers. I shouldn't say that with so many biologists in the room, but it was, at least from where I sat, led in significant part by lawyers. And it was about lobbying for legislation and litigating in the courts. And the vanguard of the environmental movement in the 70s was very much centered around those things, getting laws in place, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the pesticide laws, the Endangered Species Act, and about fighting out the issues in those laws in the federal court system. So a lawyer was the thing to be, and I went to law school, and I was a litigator for quite a long time. But this field has changed in fundamental ways that are implied in what Ruth has already said. In those days, in this country, the environmental movement was very nationally focused, right? Very focused on relatively acute problems here at home: air pollution, water pollution, contamination, et cetera. And we were using the tools we had here at home to deal with those problems. And then slowly, over the following maybe 20 years, we began to understand that the problems we were up against were actually much more profound, and they were global. They were global in terms of the impacts that we were having on the planet, most conspicuously climate change, but not just climate change, right? Acidification of the oceans, the disruption of the nitrogen cycle, the list goes on. But they were also global in the sense they were being driven by global forces. You couldn't sit in the US and pass new laws to regulate industries and solve these problems. So that somehow we had to figure out how to get to that kind of scale, how to be able to take on global drivers of global impacts in a context which didn't have the same tools that we were used to. International governance is nowhere near as strong as governance in this country. So you can't just lobby and litigate. Lobbying and litigating are still important, but they're just not nearly enough. And of course, the problems are much more complicated. So our field evolved a lot over the last 30 or 40 years. Environmental activism evolved a lot. And it was partly about how do you step up to that kind of scale to take on a global problem? How do you deal with that kind of complexity? How do you find a way to mobilize many more forces for change than we have needed before? And that means you've got to look beyond governments. You've got to look to other actors who can be part of the solution. And this gets to what I would say is, in some ways, good news, which is the globalization of the economy. The globalization of the economy can be seen as a driver of a whole lot of destruction. Right? A lot of the forest loss in the Amazon is a globalized market for soy and beef, especially globalized on the soy side. Right? A lot of the rainforest destruction in Southeast Asia is the global market for palm oil. A lot of the destruction of fisheries across the world is the globalized market for seafood. But that global dimension gives us handles we didn't have before. And that's what you're beginning to see happen now. Over the last really 15 or 20 years, we've begun to see that there is the potential, at least, to harness markets as engines for moving the economy towards sustainability. That doesn't happen automatically, and I don't want it to sound too rosy, but there are opportunities there we hadn't seen before. And it's partly about creating market mechanisms that really reward sustainable practices. And then secondly, it's about enlisting big players in those markets to take that change to scale. And you may have various strong feelings about Walmart, for example, but Walmart has been a big player in this context. Right? On some issues, Walmart has made a big difference in moving whole industries towards more sustainable practice. And the same is true of Coca-Cola, of Unilever, of Nestle, of many other big, big companies. And part of what we see is companies with big brands have become exquisitely sensitive to the public's growing concern about these issues. and at least a significant part of the public wanting to buy with confidence that they're not a part of the problem, right? That they're not buying products that were made at the expense of rainforests or the oceans. Now let me just take one example. A great example of how this is playing out is Brazil, and Ruth has already touched on that a little bit. Brazil, you see many, many pieces, as she said, coming together to actually bring deforestation down 70% in the last 10 years in the Amazon. And that is government big time. The Brazilian government in a very serious way, creating a huge network of protected areas, also cracking down on illegal deforestation. It's also NGO campaigns which brought this issue to the fore, and it is companies stepping away from sourcing soy and beef that were part of the problem. So Brazil is a very interesting initial success. And palm oil is a second one that's now taking shape, and this is what I'm deep in at the moment from this position here at Stanford. Palm oil is in half the products in the grocery store. You probably have no idea, but you ate palm oil today, I can promise you. And if you didn't eat it, you used it to wash your hair or you put it on your lips. So it is in every product you can imagine. It is the second most valuable commodity, agricultural commodity in global trade. And it is a huge driver of rainforest loss across Southeast Asia. 85% of it's produced in Indonesia and Malaysia. For that reason, Indonesia has been the third largest source of carbon emissions, of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, right? Because it's cutting down so much forest, in part because of palm oil production. So big deal from an environmental perspective. And a big part of the economy, but completely invisible. And so 10 years ago, WWF started actually creating a roundtable on sustainable palm oil to define what sustainable practices are and help move the industry in that direction. And then, God bless them, came Greenpeace and went after Unilever and then Nestle to shine a spotlight on the fact that their biggest products were made with palm oil, which was destroying the rainforests and killing the orangutans. And Unilever and Nestle signed up to sustainable palm within the space of a week. Right? And then brought other companies on board. And we now have buyers of palm oil who add up to more than 60% of the global market who have committed to eliminating deforestation from their supply chains. So that's pretty interesting. Right? Yeah, thanks. I did that. So that's pretty interesting. Now here's the hard part. That doesn't actually get you home. Right? That doesn't actually transform the palm oil sector because that's complicated. And what we now see is supply chain imperatives colliding with the realities of rural development in Indonesia, right? And trying to figure out how do we take this opening and actually transform how palm oil is really grown. And that's the challenge we're up against next. But we have an opening there like none we've ever had before. And it is an example of how these big global levers actually are beginning to create opportunities for us to get to the scale we have to get to solve these problems.
Great, thank you. Well, there's such good news in that, but also such challenge to actually getting the rest of the way. It's so connected with so many other things that people need and that developing nations need. And so I want to definitely come back because I think all three of you can speak to that. Let me go to Roz Naylor. Many of you. Adam has showed up. Roz, you're on whether Adam's here or not. So you have heard from Roz before. She is the Wrigley professor in the School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. She's a senior fellow in the Woods Institute for the Environment and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. She leads Stanford's Center for Food Security and Environment. And she is an advisor to so many organizations, foundations, corporations around the world on issues of food security and environment. So this is perfect to have you here in this conversation tonight, Roz. You know, I think you could pick up where Jim left off, I'm sure, and talk about the consequences, the connections between the palm oil opportunity but what it means for poverty alleviation, what it means for individuals' well-being. And you could go that direction if you want, but I also want to just raise the possibility at some point tonight of bringing some of these issues back to the local scale to California. And one of the things that Roz is very, very involved in and very knowledgeable about is the connection between food and water and climate change in California. So Roz, you can pick which one of those directions you want to go, and then we'll come back and get the other one at a different point.
Okay. Is this on?
Yep, you're on.
Okay.
Thank you,
Pam. And I will make the connection with Jim by saying on such short notice, I didn't put my palm oil-based lipstick on. So sorry, I look like I just came out of the gym, which is essentially what I did. So it's really nice to be part of this panel because Jim and Ruth are two people I admire so much, and Pam, of course, a long-term colleague and mentor of mine as well. The water issue in California is a great place to start. And since Jim started on the fact he was a lawyer and where he started with regulation and so forth, I will say that I'm an economist, even though I'm in the School of Earth Sciences. I'm one of the few economists on the faculty there. And the way economists tend to be very rosy because they see markets sorting themselves out. When there's a shortage, there will be incentives to adapt, necessity being the mother of invention and so forth. And so when you look at the debates that have gone on over the years, say Julian Simon, I hate to, on the one hand, and Paul Ehrlich, the economists always make it look so easy that we're just going to invent our way out of this, that the economic incentives and motivation will just turn the coin so that we can sort of adapt and move through this. Now, it makes it much more difficult when certain resources like water aren't priced in the market very well. And agriculture, Ruth, when you come back to our need to feed ourselves as a global society and urban systems, the competition between urban areas and rural areas for water is going to become more intense. Climate change is going to make the water issues more intense. And we're certainly seeing this in California right now. One of the problems, I'm sure you've been keeping track of the legislation and the bills that have been passed here in California. Jerry Brown has made, I think, enormous headway in terms of making these bounds, getting the proposition on the ballot to have the Groundwater Sustainability Act passed in the fall, which really requires the local water districts to come up with a sustainable water plan that will then go forward, and that plan has to be put in place, has to be created by 2016 and then put in place by 2017. There's institutions that have to go along with this, which slows it down, and as it's slowing it down, of course, farmers are pumping more vigorously, as you probably read in the New York Times the other day. But the fact that we're moving ahead with actually a really major legislation, if the water districts can't do this at the local level, the state will come in and start to regulate. And this is a new way of thinking about water than we've had in the past. Then the second one that you've probably heard of was just recently when Jerry Brown said, oh my God, we're at 4% of historical water in the Sierra and in our water system right now. So we're going to mandate a 25% reduction, but for non-agricultural users. And we all know that 85–90% of water is going to agriculture. So you're probably saying, okay, what's the big deal here? The big deal is that there are historical water rights that are really difficult to navigate for these agricultural users. But I think the Secretary of Agriculture and Jerry Brown are going to come up again with a third piece of this in the coming weeks. Now, from my perspective as an economist, this would be an ideal time to actually create a really functional water market in California. We don't have one that is working with the tandem of a market and regulation sort of coupled together. But if you're really going to impose a 25%, 50% reduction, say in non-agricultural users, there's a high willingness to pay for water, and farmers, if there was a market for this, could irrigate and use water in a much more efficient way, invest in water-saving technologies over the term, and sell water into these other districts. This takes time, of course, to adjust, but it's an opportunity, again, if you can utilize markets in a really constructive way. And it's clear, I think, at this stage in California, it's time to be thinking pretty carefully about innovative ways to do this. I sit on the board of the Nature Conservancy for California, and one of the questions that comes up when we talk about this issue is, who's going to represent the ecosystem? Who's going to represent the salmon in these markets and so forth? Is this all voluntary and has to come through, and foundations and so forth? And the state right now has already imposed in that groundwater bill a certain allocation of water in the Sustainable Water Act for wildlife, fish and wildlife. And it could impose in a water market also a certain allocation for fish and wildlife, which I think is an important aspect that California has that most states don't actually have. So there are encouraging possibilities, but the fact is these institutions, just like the large corporations and the markets, take a long time to sort out. This does take time to sort out. But it's interesting when you look over time how quickly things can flip when you need them. I think, unfortunately Adam's not here, but he works in the energy. We've seen massive transitions in our energy over a really short period of time in the past few years. And that's one example, for better or for worse, in how we're sorting this out. Yeah. So that's one example. I work a lot, I'll just finish here, in developing countries where actually the climate impacts are, in California, when we look at, is this drought climate driven or is it part of a period of long-term variability? I mean, we know we're going through climate variability right now. We know we are going to have increasing impacts of climate change. We can't say for sure this particular extreme is due specifically to change and not variability. But we know that's where we're heading. All of the data say that's where we're heading, that it will be a warmer climate, whether it's wetter or drier in different places. It will be warmer with much more evaporation and soil moisture loss. The most extreme impacts of this warming is going to occur in the tropics and subtropics, where they'll really go out of bounds in terms of their growing season temperatures. During the past 100 years, the next 100 years are going to be in a completely different bound of temperature. And these are the countries generally that have the highest food insecurity, the lowest ability to actually invest in different types of technology that can manage and adapt to this kind of climate change. There are a lot of different local opportunities. One of the projects that we've been involved with has been just the use of distributed small-scale irrigation that relies on solar technology to pump in a very easily monitored way to irrigate high, more nutritious crops, not just the staple grains, for communities that have never had sort of access to water. I mean, Africa, 95% is still rain-fed. These kind of inventions where you're combining an energy source with a water source with a nutrition source, I think are the model going forward, especially if they're smaller scale, distributed, can be monitored, and we know what we're trying to monitor now. So I'm optimistic, even though I'm scared to death. I mean, obviously that's why we're all here at night talking to you, is because we are worried about these issues. But I see a lot of reasons for ingenuity to take hold.
Well, so that really goes back to Ruth's big ratchet. The idea, I was going to ask Ruth, as you add something as dramatic, potentially disruptive as climate change into the storyline that we have of how we've adjusted and taken advantage of opportunities over the millennia, doesn't matter. Does climate worry you more than you've been worried before? Or has Roz just proved your point that we'll figure out a way to get out of it?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to give the impression that my point is we'll always figure our way out of it, and it's just so easy, we just have to turn it over to the economists or the engineers. I don't mean that. It's a lot of hard work, and what I tried to portray in the book is just how much work it is that goes into each one of these pivots, or accidents or something, but it's a lot of...
Yeah, it's just not going to happen by itself.
It doesn't just happen by itself. Yeah. I do worry about climate, of course. Everyone worries about climate because we are clearly taking our system out of the realm in which we have developed our whole infrastructure for the last 10,000 years, since the end of the last glacial age. But I worry about climate in the context of the governance systems that we have to deal with it. So in the California case that Roz brought up, efficient water pricing, efficient, improved governance of the water rights that everyone knows has all of these historical quirks, is what will help get through dealing with climate. I do also worry about the hardship that will be felt by the poorest, the most food insecure people. I also know that they are extremely resourceful and ingenious because they have to be. That's their only option. So I don't see people or farmers being passively sitting back and letting climate change happen to them. People will change and people will adapt, and no doubt there will be hardship.
Okay. So all three of you talked about getting, wonderful sort of innovative approaches that are moving us in the right direction, but you I think all got to the point of saying, okay, so now all the right things need to come together. The governance systems, the knowledge capital, the social and cultural capital of a place. The knowledge has to come in at the right time and in the right place. How do you see all of those pieces in that coupled human environment system coming together to succeed, to push the palm oil trajectory all the way through, or to deal with the water and food situation in California, for example? Are there examples of places where all those things have come together and we've successfully achieved something that sounds so good as your examples right now?
I don't think any of us wants to answer that question. I will say a little bit about that question.
You can answer any question you want on that one.
I think it's a super important question. One is always a little bit reluctant to point to a place and say we have succeeded, right?
Yes.
Because
back to Ruth's point, we're never there.
Can be ephemeral, right? And so I would actually, one clear one is the Amazon, which Ruth was talking about before. I mean, the progress. And what you've seen in the last 10 years is a decoupling of agricultural production and deforestation in a very dramatic way. So soy and beef production is up, and deforestation is down, as I said before, 70%. So pretty dramatic, right? And it clearly is a case in which these many pieces did come together.
Are there losers? There's winners and losers?
I'm sure there are people who would say there are losers. I mean, at a macro level, no. I mean, I think that is, the industry is doing well. I think and maybe Ruth would have details here that I don't have. The forest is doing well. You have a lot more protection for indigenous reserves, for example, than you had 15 or 20 years ago. I mean, you have some things clearly much better. People who were logging illegally are probably worse off than they were.
Yeah.
But what you had was this explicit combination of public pressure, international public pressure, corporate pressure and commitments, and a government that was very serious about acting on those things, right? And as I was saying in the case of palm oil, I think the significance of the corporate commitments is the opening they create, right? They don't by themselves get you to success, but they create an opening you didn't have before. And in the case of Brazil, the government really stepped up in pretty impressive ways. In terms of the rigor of enforcement, in terms of the sophistication of monitoring, in terms of the implementation of protected areas, in terms of realigning finance to support a shift in the right direction. So I think Brazil, even though fragile, right, because any success like that is fragile, I think Brazil tells you you can get these pieces to come together. Indonesia, more difficult in a variety of ways than Brazil, right? But nonetheless, it gives you hope it gives you an example of what can happen. And I think in Indonesia, we're going to have a similar challenge. Can you get those pieces to come together? Can you get people to step up to commitments they wouldn't make otherwise because they can see the other pieces coming together? And that's the cause of the moment there.
Okay. Ruth, do you have any additions to that, knowing Brazil as you do? Are there any tricks in there that Jim didn't cover in his?
No, I would.
You need Marina Silva.
Yes, echo what Jim said.
You need leadership, right? You need leadership.
Yes, that the governance in Brazil was absolutely pivotal to that ephemeral success, because again, all successes are ephemeral and lead to some other problem. And that is a different situation than in Indonesia, where the governance is not as strong. Brazil has a long history of monitoring, which Indonesia does not. So I think that what that speaks to, another difference is the products that were coming out of Brazil, you can trace where they're used pretty readily, whereas palm oil is used in so many products it's harder to trace. So there are a lot of differences, and I think if there's one thing that we've learned about success is that it needs to be tailored to the specific situation. And if we think we can take the Brazilian story and transplant it to Indonesia, that's not going to lead to success. We need to really understand the context for each place and each situation, each commodity.
But you can probably list a set of general requirements for good things to happen, and leadership is obviously one there. And leadership may be part of the answer for how California is moving right now. Roz, I wanted to come back to the California water agriculture story, because I think a conversation I had with you, you were raising the issues of how the regulations and actions around agriculture in response to climate change could look good in terms of water use, but could have unintended consequences for some of the poorest people in the state, you know. So another one of those unintended consequences, you can't get all the pieces right. Do you think that there are ways around that or solutions for that?
The best outcome here would be to have an agricultural system that is much more efficient in water use than it is currently. But the shakeout to get from here to there, we've already seen a lot of idling of cropland, and a lot of the poorest people in California are in the farmer and farm growing areas, and are at soup kitchens and are in pretty desperate shape. I mean, I've talked to the Secretary of Ag in California, and she's worried a lot about the crop sector, but she's worried about the food security sector in this state too, and how many people and families are going food insecure. So it's a tough balance. And I was thinking when I was listening to Ruth talk and Jim talk that the biggest global challenge is this need, I think. We haven't really talked about population growth yet. We have 7.3 billion now, but we're going to go towards 9 billion or more. And for economies that have growing populations, they not only have to feed those populations, but they have to employ those populations. And once you start needing to find jobs for all these people, then the resource use intensity at all levels starts going way up. Indonesia, one of the trickiest things in having them reach this conclusion, I think, by the time the December meeting happens at COP21, is that the current president ran on a ballot of poverty reduction, and if he doesn't see a poverty reduction measure in how these firms operate alongside an environmental measure, he's going to be less enthusiastic. And we're trying really hard to lay the groundwork to make sure that poverty alleviation measure can also, or spread the gains of this particular activity. Palm oil is so interesting. Ruth and I were talking at dinner. It's all these shades of gray, and these companies, a lot of these companies are doing much better in terms of their environmental stewardship. There's no question about it. But the gains are accruing to these large companies, and they vary significantly with the extent to which they engage smallholders, engage poor people, in these countries in their activities, and so part of it is in the supply chains. And here's another, I always think the best way to start thinking about solving a problem is to get out of Stanford and go into the field and see what's actually happening in these places, because you learn so much more when you're actually in the field. So just like Ruth has been in Indonesia recently, and Jim has, I also have, and when you find out how the supply chain is working, palm oil actually has to be, you pick these fruits off of the palm, and they actually have to be processed and milled within about a 24 to 48 hour period, or the oil goes rancid, it goes bad. And so where the actual processing facilities are located and how big they are really dictates how much land is going to be cleared around them, and what the configuration is actually looking like. Now, a lot of the big companies have big mills that are about 60 tons an hour of processing, and then they need a lot of land around them to make that efficient. And, you can see the scaling of it. Now, if there was a compatible approach to say, let's have smaller distributed mills, where let's monitor them for only sourcing from farms that have not cleared new forest areas that are on more degraded land and involve smallholders, you can see a new configuration. That requires public policy in combination with what companies are doing. And so I think what we're all talking about is the same thing, but these are the pieces. You can't have the corporate sector without having the public policy sector actively engaged in a constructive way.
Yeah, great.
Can I just pick up on two things here? And we'll try not to make this whole hour about palm oil, although it's super interesting.
Yeah, and I'm going to open this for questions, so get ready.
I'm not going to, sorry? Okay, yeah. Good detail. That's a good way of thinking about it. No, I just wanted to pick up on two things that from what Roz said. One is these agendas are going to need to be development-centered. Right? I mean, the only way we break through on palm oil is it's an agenda which is about improving the livelihoods of rural, especially rural poor people in Indonesia, and at the same time taking production out of the forest. Right? And I think there is a path there, but it's going to have to clearly be development-centered. But the second thing I wanted to pick up on is both in the case of water in California and in the case of palm oil in Indonesia, one of the things we have to get much better at is investing in the transition. The transition to the way things should work often has very acute costs for poor people or other people who are invested in the current system. And we are not very good at investing in that bridge. So in the case of palm oil, it is actually financing poor small farmers to tear up their trees and plant trees that will produce a lot more palm oil without going into the forest. That's a simplified version. Yeah. But you have to be able to find a way to finance that transition so it really can work for them, as opposed to just saying, well, you have to do better. And I think across one situation after another, getting much better at focusing on the need to make that bridge so people really can make the change is actually centrally important.
And where do the resources come for that?
But I think, you've got all these rich companies saying, we want sustainable palm. They have an obligation, I think, actually to step up. You got a lot of public money floating around Indonesia, right? $1 billion from Norway for deforestation. Some of that money needs to be about how do we actually help make this transition work.
Yeah, that's, I think, an excellent point. And I think we've seen that in every sector of the sustainability challenge. I want to open to your questions. I could go on for the rest of the night asking some, and maybe I will come back. But does anybody have a question for this? There are microphones on each side. If you wouldn't mind, if you can fight your way out to the microphones, that would be best. And we'll start over here.
Great. So first of all, thank you for an excellent series through the school year. I really appreciate you setting this up. As an alumni, it was great to be able to come back. Right. I do have a suggestion. I have a question. The suggestion is if you do a series next year, maybe open it up to the different schools to have them talk about what in engineering, medicine, law is happening with respect to sustainability, because every one of them has a stake to make this work. My question is, it seems like the elephant in the room is that there's too many of us. There's too many people in the earth to maintain the sustainability, and the poorer nations are trying to get to the level of the richer nations, and that's clearly it's going to throw another wrench just not the simple math of adding more people to the earth. What is being done in dampening down the curve of human growth? That's my question. I don't know who to direct that to.
Probably any one of us could go. So.
Well, I'll start having just come back from China, which is the world's largest population, for the next half an hour before India takes over. China has just relaxed its one-child policy, but the feeling within the country is, it hasn't enforced a one-child policy in the Western, more indigenous areas, but it has for the majority of the country. But now with the level of economic development that they have, they're not as worried about a lot of families having too many kids because they don't want actually the cost and expense of and trying to give a really good lifestyle to more than 2 kids, more than replacement. So that's going to be interesting. The ways to stop it are some mandatory way of coming in, and then it's to invest in women's education, women's health, obviously including access to contraception. But women's education and women's health, I think, are two of the best investments that you can make in terms of changing, changing that. And I think India has lagged seriously behind on that one relative to China, for example.
But total fertility rates, that is the number of children per family, have come down dramatically all over the world. And I don't know what it is in India right now, but it's getting down to probably 3. But the bottom line is that transition happens. We understand why it happens. It has a lot to do with development. Nonetheless, it takes a while before the human population levels off. So we're on the right path. The human population is not continuing to increase. It's leveling off. But whether it levels off at 9 billion or 10 billion might in fact have a lot to do with whether women are being educated, women have access to health care and family planning, women have employment opportunities and so on. So there's something to be done. The other thing I want to say on that point, just before we go on to the next questions, is that it also matters how that population consumes, how we produce the things that we're going to consume, and then what we consume and how we consume. And that's really what we're talking about here, too. We've got this population. We're trying to make sure that it doesn't continue to grow, that it levels off. But now there's a huge amount of opportunity to reduce the impact of how we produce and consume. We should go over here.
Yes, thank you. I'll keep it really short because my question was along the same lines, the elephant in the room that we're not talking about, our own overpopulation. And as you're saying, our habits of consumption and production and consumption, along with our numbers, we need to look at both of those, but we need to talk about those two things and not just sort of pretend it's not there. And so I applaud you, Roz, for bringing up the topic for a moment, and I won't ask any more questions.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
I just wanted to add, because I was just lecturing on this topic the other day, that when you look regionally, though, it's really very skewed. Almost all of the added population is actually going to be in sub-Saharan Africa, where fertility rates still are above 6 in many of those countries. And as they go into a higher consumption mode, that's a really, serious area to look at. So being able to aggressively think about investments in education and healthcare and ways to stem, a population. Women are having kids mostly because infant mortality rates are so high in some of these countries. It's all linked to health and education in ways that's not just, it requires a broader look, I think, here.
Can I add one more
Sure.
point? That most of the projected increase in population over the next few decades until it stabilizes is expected to be in urban areas, which is has both plus and negatives. So in urban areas with opportunities and access to education and so forth and healthcare, fertility rates drop. That's a pattern, as Pam said, has been seen over and over around the world. But the increase in population increase, which is so focused on urban areas, also raises the challenge of people consume more in urban areas. They're relying on the supply chain for their resources. So I think we can't decouple the thinking about population with thinking about urbanization.
Where they live, yeah.
Where they live.
Okay. Yes.
I think all of you touched on the importance of the government participation and government engagement. And 2 of you talked about specifically the Brazilian example and praised the Brazilian government for the changes they've made. So I was wondering if you could comment on why that was and what the mechanisms and motivations were. Were they truly altruistic and visionary, or were there economic motivations that helped them move in the right direction?
I think the answer is yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. All of the above, really. I mean, there was a big international spotlight on deforestation in the Amazon. Brazil, to its credit, was monitoring and reporting deforestation, so in a way that you don't see in many other countries. You had growing corporate concern, and you had Marina Silva as the Minister of Environment, who's probably one of the most visionary environmental leaders you have anywhere in government in any country, and who ran for president in the last 2 elections, but hasn't yet won, maybe next time. Marina Silva, who was a lieutenant to Chico Mendes, the rubber tapper leader who was assassinated a couple decades ago. So you had a very charismatic, very committed leader who, at least in the initial years, had the support of Lula, and who went after this in a very determined way. So that's only a selection of forces, but you had a bunch of things, I think, that contributed. And certainly government leadership in that case was very important. I don't know if you want to
Just one more aspect, quickly, is that once the pressure was there and the priority was there, the Vegetable Grower Association took upon themselves a voluntary moratorium.
Yep.
So it came, the pressure came, but then there was the mechanism to put in place this moratorium.
And the moratorium really worked. I mean, less than a quarter, I think it was 1/4% of the soy produced after that was linked to deforestation. So I mean, it was a very effective action.
And maybe, what about fundamentally a very well-educated scientific community and
high capacity country.
Yeah, high capacity. Okay, let's go over here.
Yes, just to bring it back locally, I was wondering, you were talking earlier about the bridge or the transition going from, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right,
Yep.
too loud. I have a loud voice, so I try to pull it back. Just the transition that Jerry Brown's going through right now is more of a stick. And not to say that JFK's speech is forgotten, but Jimmy Carter didn't do so well when he said, "Put on the sweater." This society elected Reagan. Just to bring it back more locally, my family sold their house, their vacation house in Las Vegas, and we're recently also thinking about selling our house here, wondering if water is going to be that scarce where the housing market collapsed. Is this really a bubble? I mean, it's gotten to the point where my family, part of my family, has been here since the 1800s, so we have water rights ranches and stuff, and there's all the other stuff. But I was just wondering, what do you see as the transition of the carrot of willing to get farmers and families that have been here for a long time that stake that claim on that water, saying, well, these are new people, these, this is ours, like, why should we give this up? You're new here, CEQA and NEPA should really transition to, like, no new development can happen unless you have 100-year water rights on it. I mean, they have requirements for CEQA or NEPA for sewer or electrical utility hookups, but there's still no water hookup.
Let's let Roz address that.
You don't want to take that? I think it's a great point. I mean, that's what the discussion has been. It's like we're in this crisis now, and yet we're still really moving ahead with a lot of development in this state that is going to really press the water resources. And it is interesting. I don't know as much as you do, I think, about the actual contracts that are out there, but I also agree that the developer community itself, not just the individuals, but those that are putting in place the development, sort of plans, really should have a no development until proven that they have the access to the water. Now, if there was a water market and if there was a negotiation with families that had the rights to the water that wanted to sell it, that would make sense. But otherwise you're just trying to get more out of limited amount unless, we get through this drought. So,
but that's a bit of a carrot anyway. The water markets are...
The water markets were the carrot that I was projecting, but...
Okay,
good point.
Thank you.
Hello there. First of all, good evening for everyone. Sorry if my English is not that good. I'm not from here. I came all the way from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
Oh.
And, back there, I'm an economist. I work in a major think tank we have in the country. And for the past few years, though I'm not a professor, I don't even have a master's degree yet. But for the past few years, I've been working in many projects that have everything to do with what you're talking about tonight, like sustainability, environment, and sustainable growth. For the past months, we've been trying to deal with a new initiative that has to do with that companies have been trying to develop and to implement in order to achieve a better model of sustainable growth that is called creating shared value. It's being implemented by Coca-Cola, the Coca-Cola company, Unilever, and etc. So I would like to know if you could tell us more about this. And I would also like to know your opinion about the future of this initiative. Do you think it will get somewhere, or it's just something that popped up some years ago and that's it?
Jim.
Yeah. So just to make sure I understood, you said the initiative is called Creating Shared Value.
Created shared value.
Creating
shared value. Yeah. Okay. So Michael Porter, the Harvard Business School guru, came up with this idea several years ago, creating shared value, as a way of building on taking corporate social responsibility into the heart of business. And I think the good thing about creating shared value is that it has had some traction in otherwise conservative parts of the business community. Right? It seems to be a concept to which is easier to relate to than others that came before. So I think that's a good thing. And you have some companies like Nestle very serious about it and doing some pretty interesting things. The catch, is it has to be good for society and also, by the way, profitable, right? And that's a bit narrowing, right? And I think it's been a bit cramped, I think, in its vision for what's possible in terms of companies' roles in being part of social change. So I think it's a good step. But if you look at what Unilever is doing on deforestation, for example, Unilever is actually going quite a bit beyond just thinking about what is shared value, right? And trying to build a company that's serious about sustainable living. Now, you can have lots of debates about the specifics, but I think they're getting to a more expansive vision than just this idea that there's a sort of objectively shared value, if that makes sense. Taking on a broader responsibility for driving social change and being part of social change. But it's a good first step.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My question is also about transition. And locally, we've seen reports bubbling up of the unintended consequences of people cutting back if they recycle or if they consume less water. Because the infrastructure stays the same, the unit cost of the product goes up, and various local governments are talking about having to raise garbage rates, raise water rates, and this I'm sure will continue. What I worry about is how this is handled, because it might turn people off from recycling, because if there's going to be all these headlines about costs, it's going to cost more if you recycle. It's a bit of a conundrum, and I'm wondering if you have ideas and what you think or have heard about the various agencies are trying to do to counteract the problem.
Anybody?
Fascinating.
Yeah.
This is one of the examples where everything we think about that comes up that seems to be a solution generates another set of issues. It's a perfect example. Yeah. That's why there's no endpoint to this.
And that's going to play out in different places depending on whether they're growing or whether their population's in decline. Or very interesting. Thank you, sir.
So I think the World Wildlife Fund said that we're consuming resources, 1.4 planets worth of resources annually, which obviously isn't sustainable. Some people have talked about, our whole economic system is based on growth, and so part of the problem is that we measure GDP, gross domestic product, and that fundamentally we need to move away from a system that is based on just consumption, and we should be measuring some sort of gross welfare index. My question is, kind of what do you think about that? But the other piece is, I mean, is it possible with a cradle-to-cradle sustainable economy to still have growth as sort of a major objective economically and still do this right? Is it even possible?
I'll start, because a lot of people say the concept of sustainable development is an oxymoron, that you can't really have, or sustainable growth, that growth itself is going to, really tax the system. Certainly, I think the way that we measure GDP sends the wrong signals for a sustainable economy. I mean, cleaning up pollution adds to GDP, for example, and there's a lot of things that are missing in this. So there are the Scandinavian countries have explored different ways to revise GDP. China has even had think tanks looking at revising the way they think about GDP. Bhutan is the great example of the gross national happiness. China's an interesting case. I don't know how many of you get the New Yorker, but there's a really fascinating article on the new president of China in the recent one, and what he is attempting to do through the Communist Party. And basically, he is saying, this extravagant growth and high consumption and so forth is kind of against our values as a communist society of equality and so forth. So as you're seeing greater inequality, this is going against the values. And we really can't tolerate this much pollution and have stability in our society. And these are all sort of reflections of what you're talking about in a way, because it combines both environmental and social sustainability. And he even says, let's take that growth rate down from 10% to 7%. We can live with 7%. Well, 7% is still really, really high. But it's interesting for an economy as big as theirs to say, we can't tolerate this growth and live with it. I think it's a really clear sign that, that we're starting to think in different societies along these lines. There are a lot of pressures in the way our financial institutions are set up to keep this kind of metric, and it makes it difficult. There's not a single decision maker here that's going to change this. But I think if some of the bigger economies, like the United States, China, and so forth, transitioned into a new way of measuring, it would really help, because others, I think, would follow.
And there are a bunch of indices being developed and tested. The Inclusive Wealth Index, for example, that includes natural capital as well as economic and social capital.
The other piece of that question was, can you have a cradle-to-cradle economy that grows? I mean, do you think you can?
Given the shortage of time, I think we should say yes.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Let's take we have maybe time for only one or two more questions, so we'll try to answer very quickly. Go ahead.
Well, first, thank you all very much for a very stimulating and fascinating presentation tonight. You have all, in one way or another, given us examples that indicate how important the government role is. And if you have a government with a really terrific person, such as Brazil had, you can have a wonderful thing happen. If you have a state like California with somebody in the governor role who gets it, we may be able to do something here that could be quite exciting and ground-setting. But we also have a problem with having a major political party that is attracting front runners in this country who are not even on the same page about climate change. And I'm sure many people in the audience heard or read in the last 24 hours about Tom Steyer's challenge about the upcoming election next year being one that he wants climate to be a top focus. I'm just wondering about your respective perceptions or suggestions about how citizens anywhere in the world and consumers anywhere in the world can have an impact on government-led entities that have control a lot of money. And I'm thinking about the World Banks, I'm thinking about the Inter-American Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank, all of which get their money from governments. but are influenced by that government's policies and political persuasion. Are we just observers, or are there more things we can do?
Thank you. Anybody want to take that one?
Well, that's a huge question for the last minute
I
of this
know.
hour.
We are.
So Edie, that's a big question. And I don't want to center just on the multilateral banks. I mean, multilateral banks are important actors here. But I think what you could take out of this discussion is that we have to find multiple ways to generate that kind of pressure. And that individuals actually can do that through multiple channels. We are voters, and that's super important. But we are also consumers who make decisions every day. And I can tell you, I've been very involved in the sustainable seafood movement over the last 15 years with various hats. And that's a movement which has gotten us to the point that the only fish you can get in McDonald's is certified sustainable fish, right? All of their fish is sustainable. About 70% of the fish in Walmart is sustainable, is certified high standard sustainable fish. You've got big movement in that market, and it comes entirely from people walking into the store and asking the guy at the fish counter, where did your fish come from? A question which 15 years ago he had never heard. Right? And it can't be more than 2 or 3% of the people in this country who've been asking that question. I bet it's 0.5%. But it's enough, right, to bring an issue to the fore, right, and to get companies actually beginning to move, and then recognizing that there are broader reasons to move and actually helping to move governments. And fisheries regulation in the US and in Europe is leagues better than it was 15 years ago. And I think that consumer movement and that market shift is actually a big part of that. So I think it's important for people to recognize you are voting every day in the supermarket, as well as when the curtain closes on election day. And that's a pretty powerful lever.
And in the other organizations we support.
Yeah.
Because
and of course
they all come together.
Fund the World Wildlife Fund.
Yeah.
And can I just add one more thing? That the society we live in, there's such a fire hose of information, and it's so difficult to sort out what's accurate and what's not accurate. So I think part of being a good consumer is being very critical about the information we get and asking a lot of questions and getting at the complexity behind all of these sustainability issues. It would be easy to think that the palm oil industry is the enemy. But the reality is much more complicated than that. So part of I think what you're getting at is that we need to be very informed and critical in our thinking and get into the nuances.
Charlie, do you think one more? Okay.
Thank you for taking my question. I really appreciate that you're flying over the oceans and protecting the globe. But I just want to share, I think it's really important that we educate our young what to do to be sustainable from an early age. I have to say I'm a proud parent who went in and did gardening in my children's grade school to teach them how a wheat seed can grow into a plant and make bread in a curriculum over a year. And that my son is at a school in Atherton which has goats and chickens and turkeys and rabbits, and they slaughter these animals for the cafeteria food. It's one of the few schools that allows you to grow food on campus and put it into the cafeteria. But what can we do as a consumer with our own yard that we can't water to plant or produce? And what can we do? What initiatives are happening for the children so that they, when they're in these urban little cracker boxes of apartments, can grow their own herbs or something in order to be sustainable?
I'll just very quickly say that there really is a movement in many parts of the world, not just the United States, certainly Europe and a lot of the developing countries, for urban agriculture. It really is an important part of food production in many places, in many cities. Not the most important, but it's playing a role in nutrition. So there's good news in that. I think people are returning to those roots in a sense. I will also just tell you all that we have a new Stanford educational farm. There's a farm on the farm for the first time in a long time. And And part of its purpose will be to outreach to the communities around us and share some of the knowledge that you're talking about. So you'll look for that on campus, on Campus Drive. Thank you.
Turn into a vegetable garden?
Yeah. But we'll have to find a way to water it, I guess, is the problem. Okay, let me thank you all for being here and for participating. And please join me in thanking these amazing, amazing